Santa Claus isn't real. Evolution isn't real. Millions of years able to do miracles of moving continents around that are billions of trillions of tons is a fairy tale.
The same day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Welcome to this episode of Hydroplate Theory University with Hydroplate Theory experts Kevin Lea and Bill Wells.
Well, welcome again to the 7th podcast of Hydroplate Theory University. Last two have been dealing with asteroids, the introduction to the asteroid chapter. And this week, Bill, who is fresh back from vacation at an air show in Wisconsin, is going to be joining us again. And we're going to be clearing up some loose ends that we left undone in the first two podcasts pertaining to the overview chapter of Dr. Brown's 9th edition. And so we're going to add just a couple items. One of them is because of the debate between Brian Lauer and Dr. Feldman. We're going to be covering one of the issues that Dr. Feldman brought up. And having, unlike what he said that Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory doesn't answer the salt that's being found off the west coast of Africa and east coast of South America. Well, we're going to see that that's not true. And we're going to explain from a hydroplate theory perspective of where all the salt came from. And so diving right into our PowerPoint slide, here is a side view that we've seen in previous slides, but I wanted to emphasize that the pre-flood seas are where the pillars came down, and the pre-flood mountains probably wouldn't have been jagged like this. Some people have said it should have been rounded. Yep, we should have could have animated those more rounded because it's just bowing up from the water here. But there's the supercritical water, which has extreme dissolving properties, was dissolving the bottom of the granite crust and the floor of the mantle. And that's going to be important for what we're going to be emphasizing today. And along with that dissolving the minerals out of the granite, what was happening is precipitating salt. So the subterranean floor underneath the entire one continent, there was a global continent that had salt water from the subterranean chambers underneath. And that water is trapped underneath the global continent, building in pressure, and is going to rupture out, as you just saw in the introduction that introduces each one of our podcasts. And so there would have been massive salt. Well, if that were true, you would expect that some of this salt escaping from the crack in the crust would have ended up on the ocean floor, and that's what we see all over the world. So that's what we wanted to emphasize with this picture. And why we're doing that is going into page 407, which I'm afraid that Dr. Feldman probably didn't read. It's in the Origin of Earth's Radioactivity. It talks about salt in this chapter because of the extreme power of the subterranean chamber water, supercritical water, that caused also fluttering of the crust, which created the electrical Z-pinch and nuclear forces that are talked about in the radioactivity chapter. But this is what Walt says, is if you look at a globe, doesn't it appear that a circular region of the Americas hydroplate was blown out to form the Gulf of America? And so right here it says, when we look at this, and this is elevation, and it shows that the Gulf of America and the Caribbean are very deep compared to, it's down to the floor of the ocean type of level. And so what that statement is saying, doesn't it look like while the subterranean water was escaping along this mid-Atlantic ridge on the east coast of the United States, so water is pouring out, eroding this crustal piece of what was just the Americas plate. While it was doing that, the extreme forces of the fluttering crust somehow cracked, broke, and caused this section to pulverize and be ejected as like a plug. It was a plug that blew out of the North American continent. And as that plug would have broken out, you would expect, based on the hydroplate theory, that there would be a lot of the subterranean floor salt in that area. And there is. And you would also expect to see plenty of salt in the Caribbean, and there is. You would expect to see, and the same thing happened in the Mediterranean. This Asia-Africa plate was ejecting water along this side, creating the fountains of the Great Deep, creating global rainfall and dirty water from the eroding crust. But it also blew this area out. And all this material that was blown out contributed to making the average mile thick sediments all over the world during the 150 days that the flood was laying down sediments. And the same thing with the Black Sea here. And people will say, well, the Black Sea doesn't have salt under it. I've checked in how the deepest they've drilled in the Black Sea, and they haven't drilled down to the area that hydroplate theory would expect there to be a large salt deposit. So we're going to, and so then he goes on to say, and part of the Europe, Africa, Asia hydroplate was blown out in the Mediterranean Sea. What about the Black Sea and the Arctic Ocean? We're not going to cover the Arctic Ocean. And what about the Caribbean? It looks like that's the case. Now, can we prove it scientifically? No. Does the evidence support that it did? Yes, it does. And later on, we're going to be dealing with salt. Salt was also found here. Walt's book does deal with the salt found on the east coast of Brazil. But he doesn't deal with it here, not because he didn't know it was there, but because he only gave the example of here. And Dr. Feldman says that Walt Brown and the hydroplate theory can't explain why salt is found here and here. And we're going to be dealing with that. Feel like I'm missing anything there, Bill?
No, looks good, Kevin. I just like to point out that this outsalting is a process that's been known for many, many decades. And it's actually has commercial applications today, is being able to extract minerals from water. So this process that's been repeatable in laboratories today is what hydroplate theory posits was occurring during in the subterranean chambers. And I think we'll be able to get into more of that as we get into the discussion of limestone. I think that'll be in our next podcast.
Yep. So this is also from Walt's book, page 407. Because the mushy mother salt layer is so fluid, it eventually pooled at the lowest possible depths. And I'm going to say of the subterranean floor, with or without the Gulf of America and Mediterranean Sea lid on it. So, again, we're saying the lid, the granite crust of the Gulf of America, Mediterranean Sea, the crust was the lid. Well, the lid blew off. And when the lid blew off, the salt before the lid blew off and afterwards is looking for the lowest possible depth to go to. And so early during the flood, I added those words of the subterranean chamber floor to make it clear. Early during the flood, the pulsating high-pressure subterranean water broke through the granite crust, contributing to the sediment layers being deposited around the globe. And as we already mentioned. And so now this is an actual, based on sonar of the Gulf of America. And so here's the Gulf of America, Texas, Louisiana. Then you see this massive salt area here. And we're going to be talking about that in a minute. And then they take this square and they emphasize it here. And so what the next verbiage is going to be explaining is these high places here some are as high as Mount Everest. And these are dimple places that are much shallower of salt. And we're going to see why here in a minute. And so this is, again, page 407 of the 9th edition, figure 220. And so this is that square place was the 135-mile square top of the map is expanded to give a three-dimensional view of pot-marked floor of the Gulf of America. And now here's what's important. Sediments almost 30,000 feet thick were then deposited on top of the 1,000-foot thick mother salt layer. So the ceiling, the granite ceiling, was pulverized and ejected, turning into sediments around the world, and left to a big area that supercritical water would have still been coming around the edge, but all the debris that's around the world that was being flushed off by the floodwaters, trees, plants, all the sedimentary material is now flowing in to that hole that has been blown in the North American continent. Sediments of 30,000 feet thick were then. See, the average thickness of sedimentary layers on the earth is 5,000 feet. 30,000 feet thick were then deposited on top of the 1,000-foot thick mother salt layer that was left when the lid blew off. And then what happens is that sedimentary stuff is pushing down on the salt, which is much less dense. And so the salt is wanting to come up above the sedimentary layers. And so how did it do that? All of a sudden, it's breaking through the sedimentary layers and creating mountains of salt that rise up through the sedimentary layers. And then the depressions, these depression areas here, are places where the salt that was buried under and couldn't pop up then just goes supply the foot of the mountain with more salt to then go up. And that's what's causing these depressions. They laterally fed the mountains. Only the hydroplate theory can explain this situation. And if you look and so then we're going to see these two places here where salt is also being formed. Again, Walt is only going to talk about this one. What we also have to realize is that they know that it's good to look for oil wherever there's salt, and the reason is because of the sediments also had large amounts of organic material that's also being buried, and the subterranean water areas where the supercritical water is coming out would have been cooking that debris into oil. So then, now let's see what Walt says on page 405. Want to take it away with reading this one, Bill?
In 2006, Brazil discovered off its Atlantic coast the largest oil field found in Western Hemisphere in the last 30 years. The Tupi oil field. It lies first under 7,060 feet of water, then under 10,000 feet of sand and rocks, and finally under 6,600 feet of salt, a total of 4.8 miles below the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. So that raises the question, how did all that oil get under such a deep, thick salt layer?
Yeah. And this is on page 405, under the heading, oil and mountains of salt, all in the right places. Why do we find oil in the area where there's salt? And that's explained by the hydroplate theory. And so once again, a pictorial representation of what we just read is that they decided to drill, first having to drop their drill through water for over a mile, 7,000 feet. And then they're going through 10,000 feet of sand and rock. Well, where did the sand and rock came from? It came during the compression event that we talked about earlier. So this podcast does assume that you watched the previous two podcasts on the overview chapter. But the compression event, when it is lifting up the mountains towards on the east side of Brazil, the land would have been sloughing off all the sand and rock, unlike what Dr. Feldman accuses the hydroplate theory and Walt Brown of not depicting the fact that there's sedimentary layers on the shelf, on the trailing edge shelf of the continents. It's not true. He made it very clear in his book, 10,000 feet of sand and rock. Then they had to go through 6,600 feet of salt. Imagine them drilling through over a mile of just pure salt. And the reason they're doing that is because they realize where there's salt, there's oil. And only the hydroplate theory explains why underneath all of this, there was organic matter that was being decomposed by escaping supercritical water from the mantle floor that cooked the organic material and made the hydrocarbons that are being found there. And so, so then that's what we're going to see after we also go to the debate. But so right here, Walt's talking about this, but we're going to see that Dr. Feldman, he wants to talk about this side over here, which is fine because the hydroplate theory explains why there's salt here too. But he's going to be explaining it based on the billions of years of history and millions of years and seafloor spreading through the Pangaea continent. And he starts off by making a big deal about how Walt saying that Africa in this picture is 35% reduced in size from its side. He wants to major on the minors. It really doesn't matter. What matters is they can't put Pangaea together. Evolutionists cannot put Pangaea together without getting rid of mass. Here's South America is gone. So they fit things together, and they do fit together to a certain extent because of the hydroplate theory explanation of why they should fit together. But there's parts of Africa that are gone. There's where's Asia? So they make a picture and try and dupe people into a false narrative because of their paradigm. And so what we're going to see now is Dr. Feldman and Brian Lauer's debate, and here's the address for it on YouTube, and Solidify Your Faith by Danny Dubinsky, and it's like a 4-hour debate and question and answer. But we're going to pick it up where he's talking about this issue. Yeah.
I'd like to add something about the Pangaea and the perception that it gives people that look at it.
Yep.
And the reason why I think that's important is because when it comes to the coal, oil, methane hydrate deposits, there's a huge amount of living material that was buried. And the Pangaea picture that people have been shown for many, many years gives the impression that is all the land that there was, and the rest is water. Whereas the pre-flood Earth, as you talked about previously, it was one entire global continent, all containing a perfect, starting off in a perfect growing environment, which would have produced much, much more living material, which would become the coal and methane and oil. So this Pangaea picture not only gives a very lopsided view of the Earth, but it greatly reduces the amount of surface area that would be available to grow all the vegetation required to produce all the fossil fuels that we have.
If you're enjoying Hydroplate Theory University, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel by searching Hydroplate Theory University and clicking our official logo. We're organizing the series into playlists for each chapter of Dr. Walt Brown's book. Right now, we're covering the chapter overviews, and once those are complete, we'll come back and explore each chapter in greater depth. You can also find every episode and chapter at hptuniversity.com. We're still finishing a few parts of the website, but everything will be there soon. Now, let's get back to Hydroplate Theory University.
Yeah, and not only the vegetation that would be required, but also the size of the vegetation. Everything, because as you said, the Earth's environment before the flood was plush. It was for longevity because there was no radioactivity on the Earth, so things lived longer. And it had a different atmosphere. The mountains weren't so high. The mist was coming up. It was a plush planet, creating what for us is the global natural gas, oil, coal deposits around the Earth, which cannot be explained easily by the evolutionary dogma. So yeah, very important point there, Bill. And thank you for that. So now we're going to get into this podcast, it was a podcast with Donnie Dubinsky. And so we're going to click on this.
So yeah, it's not a great fit because Bullard, when he did this diagram, he used the continental slope as the boundary, which he knew at the time wasn't correct, but it was the best they had at the time. So here's the Niger Delta. He even says in the paper, we know this delta is much younger than when the continents were together. So obviously that lack of fit doesn't work. But what I really want to talk about is this statement that I've seen repeated many times, that Africa was shrunk by 35%. And, you look at the size of the squares here, maybe that looks correct. That is not true. I mean, I just don't understand how somebody in good faith, without knowing that they're lying, would make that statement. And Bullard even addresses this in his paper. He says, I know it looks like the continents have been changed in size, but they haven't. It's an artifact of the Mercator projection. So I sacrificed a globe. I sacrificed a globe just to prove this point. So here I cut out Africa and I put it next to Australia, or next to South America. So look at this point here is that point there. I've colored in the equator here. And if really Africa was 35% too big, it wouldn't fit. It would be, the toe of Africa would be like down here, but it isn't. It fits exactly the same as this diagram. Now, it's not exactly the same. This is a child's globe from when my stepkids were kids. But you get the idea. This is false. And if your theory is based on false statement after false statement after false diagram, what's it worth? I mean, nothing, very little about the geology in this book is actually correct. So let's go on and look at some modern diagrams. What people use nowadays is the boundary between continental crust and oceanic crust, not the shelf edge. All those diagrams of the shelf edge in the book are completely false. And so here's the...
Okay, now, see, the other thing that Walt's going to make, and has made a point, and we made a point earlier, Bill and I did, that you don't just look at the continents based on where they are with the ocean level today. The true continents also are the shelf and the slope that you don't see. So if the continental crusts are slope and the shelves of the continents, that's being truthful, is to include those. What he just said is that they don't recognize that. Well, why? Because they need this Bullard map to work. And so he said that they reject that. Well, you don't reject, it's the continental crust. And that's why, that's why Wald includes it, because it's the ethical thing to do in this discussion. So he goes on from here.
Boundary that's used today, these are a couple papers. These are open access papers, which is why I can show them. There's no copyright restrictions. But what's really interesting here is that the way Africa and South America split, they didn't split like this. They actually rotated, they unzipped.
Okay. So notice, once again, we covered this in our podcast in the overview chapter. He says, oh yeah, they just did this. He's telling a story. I looked up what is the mass of the entire crust of America, and it's billions of trillions of tons is what AI said. So once again, when geologists talk about how continents they turn, they're just turning, they're moving. You don't just move billions of trillions of tons. You have to have a force mechanism to do so. You have to have, and only the hydroplate theory provides how continents can move on a slick, extremely slick layer of water underneath the continents. When the Atlantic ridge rose, continents can move horizontally on top of the mantle with no protrusions from the crust into the mantle. These continents are sitting down in the mantle with mohos underneath their mountains. They can't just move, but that's what geologists do. is they don't have physics. They don't have engineering to say that these things are impossible to happen. It's a fairy tale.
And so as the Atlantic Ocean was being created, there's this huge salt basin that was created. And you can see it here in this paper too. And so what was happening is the basin was closed to the north. There was evaporation that exceeded the amount of seawater that could come in. There's actually a sill called the Walvis Ridge, which presented.
Okay, so now what he's saying is that this is the birth of the Atlantic Ocean. As South America is moving away, it's opening up this area that is like a dead end. And so salt water comes in here, and then there's this dam that somehow forms. Well, the salt water comes in, and then they're going to say over millions of years it evaporates, fills up, evaporates, fills up, evaporates, creating thousands, feet of salt. And so if it's creating salt and the water ran into it to make it salt, what happened to the dam? How did the dam form to let it dry out? And then how did the dam go away? And the salt that was left, it needed more water to get inside there. But how does the water get in if it's already been elevated by increasing salt? And the only answer is millions. And the God of time and chance can make it happen because that's what we want to believe to explain salt. The fact that there's salt there is irrefutable. How it came, they tell a fairy tale based on their paradigm of seafloor spreading, Pangaea breakup without forces to explain how it happened, and then shallow seas evaporating. That's what they're left with.
Prevented open access to seawater. And so today, what we look at is here's the salt there, there's the salt there. What's the hydroplate explanation for this salt? Well, they ignore it like they ignore so much data. You have to ignore an awful lot of data to accept the hydroplate theory. So here's a cross-section. Notice it looks nothing like the cross-sections of the continental ocean boundary. The oceanic cross boundary is just beyond the edge of this cross-section. But here's the salt, 14,000 cubic kilometers of salt. You could hardly say that's trivial. And there's sediment above it, sediment below it. This has all been drilled for hydrocarbons, so we know that this exists.
Yeah, it is an incredible 14,000 cubic kilometers of salt. It is not trivial. Their explanation, millions of years of lakes filling, like the Salt Lake in Utah. It fills up salt, fills up salt, fills up salt over millions of years. Hydroplate theory has a different view that comes with the salting of the subterranean chambers coming out onto the ocean floor.
And we know that there's sediment below it. So what's the hydroplate story here? And
he just admitted they know sediment layers are below it. How did that happen? And they know that oil layers are below it. How does that happen? How do you get that salt sea to be the place where underneath it is oil?
You have several kilometers of sediment, then the salt, and then several kilometers more sediment. So the only explanation I know of that actually makes sense is that Africa and North and South America were next to each other, and there was a narrow basin, and then the pieces of salt actually fit back together. And so I think that
the only one that makes sense. Now look over here at this globe. So for millions and millions of years, South America over here is moving away from Africa over here. When they were together, this salt all congregated right here. But as it's moving away, because this seafloor spreading had popped up to cause South America to go this way, this salt stays there, and that salt stays there, while it's moving thousands of miles in an ocean over millions of years. And he says that's the only explanation that makes sense to him. Well, okay, it makes sense to him. It doesn't. I hope it doesn't make sense to everybody listening to this. The hydroplate theory makes perfect sense because it happened in a very short period of time, and both continents are having their own set of salt coming out from the subterranean chamber, as we're going to see.
That is a much better model for how this system works. And this is just the tip of the iceberg of the data that you have to ignore in order to accept the hydroplate hypothesis.
Well, so we're going to see that Walt does not ignore the data, as we're going to see as we get back to our back to our presentation. So Dr. Feldman hasn't read the hydroplate theory, and yet he says that the hydroplate theory, Walt Brown, is a fraud because he doesn't deal with the salt in those two locations, but he does. So Dr. Feldman misrepresented. We feel sorry for him because he's been deceived by his own paradigm. And besides that, this is all the oil and salt. And a lot of these areas also have salt all along Africa. Why is that? Well, it's because Africa was moving away from the mid-oceanic ridge during the compression event. And what we see is that as Africa is moving this way, as Africa is moving to the east, it's coming off of this subterranean chamber floor that had salt on the bottom. And so it's no surprise that it's right at the area that all along this fracture in the crust that was a result of where the crack was here until it spread and the mid-oceanic ridge rose into the middle of the crack. There's going to be salt there. And so for Brazil, South America, to move to the west, you're going to find salt here. The hydroplate theory explains it because there was massive amounts of salt underneath the entire continent. And we have evidence that even under America today, the deep bore hole project of the Russians, which is close to 7 miles deep, they found broken up granite with salt water. You cannot get surface water below 5 miles in the crust because the pressure is so intense that all the pockets are closed up. You can't, just like you can't get a septic system to drain in hard clay, you can't get water to go below 5 miles. They go below that and they find crushed granite, broken up granite, and salt water, which came up from the subterranean chamber through the fractured crust when the compression event happened. There's evidence of salt underneath the continents. Another one that Dr. Feldman denied, that Brian mentioned, that they have scientifically discovered that there is brackish aqueous solution underneath the mountain ranges and plateaus of the world. And there's examples of that given in Dr. Brown's chapter. There was salt water under the crust, and it came out as the continents were moving. So where does it come from? According to the hydroplate theory that Dr. Feldman and his paradigm refuses to admit that Wells talked about. Bill, why don't you go ahead and read this one?
Well, the hydroplate's explanation states, during the early stages of the flood, some of the sediments loaded with organic material, especially forests ripped up by the floodwaters, were swept off the edge of the hydroplates and onto the chamber floor. It, like the chamber's ceiling, had also been made porous and filled by the supercritical water. Figure 58 on page 135, picture of the black smokers, gives clear evidence of, one, this porosity, and two, that the flood was recent and that the ocean floors are young.
So it's saying that, again, the supercritical water was eating away at the ceiling and eating away at the floor. As it ate away at the floor, supercritical water went deep down into the mantle. Today, some of that supercritical water is still trying to come out, it is coming out with all the minerals associated with dissolving the mantle material. And so the hydroplates settled as they were settling on the floor. Later on in the flood, a lot of the ocean that was underneath the crust has now been jettisoned up to become the ocean that we're experiencing today. Some of it was laying down the sedimentary layers all over the continents, and some of it was blown into space. So the global crust is coming down closer and closer and closer to the mantle. And as it's doing that, the escaping water is wanting to flush out the precipitated salt that was on the chamber floor. And then during the compression event, the continents are moving off and getting away from that salt layer. And that's why we see salt on the seafloor. And because oil is too viscous to penetrate layers of wet salt, the oil deposits have been trapped for thousands of years, going back to our diagram of first water, then rock and sand that washed off during the compression event, then salt, and then the oil that was underneath the salt. And we see again, this is a result of these continents, including the continental shelves, which have a very nice fit along the rupture location, which the mantle popped up into. And we have smokers all over the ocean floor in every ocean in the world. This was shocking to them when they first found them. Perfectly explained by the hydroplate theory. Are there large salt deposits on the ocean floor east of Africa? No. You wouldn't expect it east of Africa because Africa was moving on to an area that had already been cleaned off. Instead of moving off of the salt, it's moving on to an area that's already been cleaned off of salt. And so, but look at this. They say no large massive layers of evaporate salt. Well, see, the whole AI paradigm is evolutionary narrative. And so there hasn't been millions of years of evaporating seawater to create salt. And so HPT, there's no layer from the granite dissolved by supercritical water with minerals in the subterranean chamber, like those found in the Mediterranean Sea, etc. And then they say the breakup of Pangaea, another word from Pangaea is Gondwana, and sediments in this region are dominated by water runoff, by water running off the continent deltas rather than salt accumulation. There is no salt on the east side of Africa because the continent was moving away from the supercritical water and associated precipitated salt. That's a hydroplate theory explanation, makes perfect sense. And here we've shown this before. You would expect to find salt in these areas because it ran off of the salt layer. That's where you're going to find the salt. You're not going to find the salt on this area because it's running over stuff that's already been, the salt's been removed. That's why you don't find it on the leading edges of the continental plates. So now we're going to shift subjects, and this goes back to something that I really wish we wouldn't have forgotten earlier, and that is this is the mountain range that we talked about in the previous broadcast. That was a horizontal compression. All those layers were soft. They came just like if you ran through a carpet up against a wall. It's gonna bend and fold. But these mountains all formed in a day, in an hour actually. But we have to remember that Noah was floating in a barge, a boat that was made to just survive, not go anywhere. Didn't need a brow. Floating in a barge, and at the time of the compression event, the highest land is 22.5 feet deep. So as long as that barge is not 22.5 feet down, it's not going to hit anything on the entire surface of the world. What we have to understand, and the Bible tells us, is that when the compression event happened, we don't know how deep, the shallowest place was 22.5 feet. We don't know. It could have been a few hundred feet was the deepest place because, again, the earth became relatively flat spherically. So there wasn't huge, deep, thousands of feet ocean at the time that the flood is about to stop and the compression event is going to cause the dry land to appear again. But when it did come up, it needed to come up underneath Noah's Ark. The ark landed on the top of the mountains of Ararat on the day of the compression event because anywhere else would have resulted in the ark being destroyed by the waters running off into the freshly opened ocean basins. So God ordained for the place where the mountains came up was right under the ark because it has to be at the high point. So it's not part of the deluge that's running off to the newly formed ocean basins, which would have tumbled the ark and killed everybody inside of it and destroyed the ark. If mountain formation was slow, there would have been no wind. Catastrophic plate, people think it was slow. The Bible says it was quick. The Bible says there was a wind. Mountain formation was rapid. And why don't you read the verse here, Bill?
Genesis 8, 1-4. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, in the mountains of Ararat.
So at the end of the 150 days, waters decreased. So it was a 150-day flood. Then the ark rested on the 7th day of the month on the mountains. That's exactly the same 150 days. So the day the compression event started, the Bible says, is the day that the ark landed. It hit the land that was underneath it, which is still, there's all kinds of global cataclysms going on, but it is now safe because it's beached on a high point. And the wind, and for anybody that's been around, I mean, here in Seattle, they blew up the King Dome here years ago. And so they did a controlled explosion of the King Dome. And what happens is when that dome came down and displaced all the air that was inside the King Dome, it just shot out debris from the explosion in the collapsing King Dome stadium and just spread it all over Seattle. Same thing was seen by the dropping of the towers because you're displacing the air. And so when God said he made a wind to pass over the earth, it was because the mountains were coming up and pushing the air that was above them out of the way. And that would have caused a global wind. It's not like the wind caused the waters to go away. It was a result of the land coming up into the atmosphere, creating the wind. Same kind of wind, but to a much less degree, happened when the Red Sea was parted. Exodus 14:21, Bill.
Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided.
So this kind of leaves us with the mental picture that when God was opening up the Gulf of Aqaba, which is the Red Sea, to open that up for that distance, that it was from the east to the west. And so as it's opening up, it's creating this massive wind, again, because of this displacement of air by moving it out of the way and allowing the air to come into that divided Gulf of Aqaba, Red Sea. And then and I misspoke on a previous broadcast. I said it's in Proverbs that this says this, but it's in Job 38. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I fixed my limit, God talking, my limit for it, and set bars and doors, and I said, this far you may come, but no further, and here your proud waves must stop. He's telling Job, why are you arguing with me? I created the earth. I created the flood. I stopped the flood by shutting it off at the continental slopes on the trailing edge and the leading edge. I'm the one that did that. Why are you arguing with me is really the context of this section of scripture. And so he tells Job, I shut the doors when the continental slopes sat down onto the mantle after most of the subterranean water has been ejected during the flood event. And the continents set down, and then the mantle then rose up and sealed off this crack. So now this picture is a post-flood right after the compression event. And it's showing that the mid-oceanic ridges were above water. And they would have been, because there's massive amounts of water that are still trapped in the sedimentary layers that are going to be running off into the oceans, the streams for years and years and years until they dry up. And that's adding to the water level here. Plus, the mantle is going to be deformed by the rising extra mass of the continents, and it's going to sink down into the mantle, and the mantle is going to be bowing up and pushing the sea level. But this mid-oceanic ridge at first is there, and that's why Noah's family and their descendants were able to travel the entire world, because there were land bridges. And we're going to see that there's evidence of that fact, historical fact, by a Hopi legend. And so this is on page 521, endnote 5. How was the earth divided in Peleg's day? The Bible talks about in Peleg's day, the earth was divided. After the flood, all of a sudden the earth was divided by water. The rising sea levels caused land bridges to go away. And this is from New York Penguin Books, 1963, before Walt Brown came along. This is just, see, Frank Waters' Book of the Hopi. Book of the Hopi legends, Hopi Indians, this is how they got to America from over on Asia side, because they left where the ark landed in the mountains of Ararat. And their legend says that their ancestors came to the Americas after a gigantic flood. Their ancestors used many family-sized rafts made of hollow reeds, bamboo, and island hopped across the mid-oceanic ridge for many years north and east to the Americas. The steep coastlines, today's continental slope, which the lower sea levels would have exposed on the west coast of Americas, forced them northward until they could land. Rising water later drowned the chain, covered the mid-oceanic ridges and the other islands along the sides of islands along their path. And so the mid-oceanic ridge went away, according to a Hopi legend. And so, the seawater was, let's say the seawater was here. You're taking a boat from Asia to go east, and you're hitting islands all along the way because the sea level is so much lower. And you come up against this steep slope, and you can't land on the Americas until you keep going north and north and north, and then you find probably up in the Columbia River, where you have the river basin that you can go up the river and then come up and onto the land. That's what the Hopi legend said. And so this is what it would have looked like. There would have been more land masses exposed. This is a map generated by known levels. If you just lower the sea level, and this is what would have happened. Over time, this explains why animals and people were able to migrate until we had the current look of the continents. So, I made this equation about the evolutionary way of looking at things and the biblical way of looking at things. Every kid knows that when you have a frog and you get a kiss, the frog gets kissed by a princess, it turns into a prince. They know that's a fairy tale, an obvious fairy tale. But what we have from the evolutionists is, in the beginning there was nothing, and all you need is Carl Sagan's billions and billions of years, and the universe, including all life on Earth, it comes about. And that, too, is a fairy tale for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. Unfortunately, as we've emphasized before, people are caught in the paradigm that there can't be a God they answer to. Anything but God. As long as it's not the God of the Bible that says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's where most people are. That's where most people in the world, anything but that. And yet the evidence is overwhelming. No, Dr. Feldman, the salt did not come over millions and millions and millions of years of drying shallow seas. It came during the compression event and before that, the rupture phase of the hydroplate theory. How do you have your thousands of feet of pure salt over those millions of years? There's not volcanic layers and everything else inside. please, we pray for you, Dr. Feldman. We know you're being deceived by those that have taught you with a fairy tale, and you believe the fairy tale. It's like you're like a kid that is now, as an adult, you still believe in Santa Claus because you wanted to believe in Santa Claus as a kid and it was so much fun. But when you grow up, kids leave Santa Claus because they know it's not true. The evidence doesn't support it. And so we beg you, and every other evolutionist is watching this, Santa Claus isn't real. Evolution isn't real. Millions of years able to do miracles of moving continents around that are billions of trillions of tons is a fairy tale. And we pray that you'll instead turn to the God who created the heavens and the earth, told us how he did it, and all the evidence supports his narrative. And we hope you'll join us for our next podcast. And so God bless you, and we'll keep, the next podcast is going to be delayed for a couple of weeks because Bill and I are going to be going off to a creation seminar in Florida. And so it'll be a couple of weeks before we have another one. God bless you.
Thank you for viewing this episode of Hydroplate Theory University. We hope you'll return for future episodes. Please like, subscribe, spread the word, and be sure to visit creationscience.com, where you can find more great hydroplate theory resources.